this point, we've covered carbohydrate metabolism or digestion of carbohydrates. And you have partially filled out your graphic organizer. You're going to want to have this guy again because we're going to add to it a little bit more. Okay, so now would be a good time to fill in your graphic organizer. We're trying to put these different types of digestion and metabolism in perspective. So we talked about the digestion of carbohydrates, and eventually this led us to the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, and this was where we got the most energy from. So what I want you to notice now when we talk about the digestion of triacylglycerols, we are going to break those triacylglycerols into fatty acids and glycerols. So that's a reaction that we've already covered. It's hydrolysis of triacylglycerols. We will then further break down our fatty acid through fatty acid oxidation. What that gets us is a pyruvate. That's exactly what we want because now we can enter aerobic respiration. We can enter the mitochondria in the presence of oxygen, convert those pyruvates to acetyl-CoAs, enter the citric acid cycle, and release those high energy electrons and those hydrogen ions so that we can go through this magical last step of aerobic respiration where we generate all of our energy. I know we're not there yet, but just previewing this, check it out. We will eventually be doing the same thing with our proteins when we talk about the breakdown of those. Where do they enter glycolysis or the citric acid cycle to produce energy? Thinking back to Chem 1201, we know that we get 9 kilocalories of energy per gram of fat. So the most energy is stored in fats as compared to carbohydrates and proteins. Your tissues are capable of storing unlimited quantities of fat. They're really good at it. It's a great storage form of energy. However, your body prefers to use glucose as an energy supply before fat, which means anytime you have glucose present, so you've been eating carbohydrates, your body's going to break that down and use that as an energy source before it uses the fat. Think about the fat as being kind of your stopgap measure. If you didn't get any carbohydrates or any food that day, then your body's going to go into those stores of energy and break those down to get ATP. So if you have glucose present, the fatty acid oxidation, which is how we break down fats, is inhibited as long as you have enough glucose available. If you were to stop eating carbohydrates, you would use up all your reserves of carbohydrates, all of those glycogen stores after one day of fasting. And your fats, however, can provide calories for an entire month. So this is kind of your body's way of storing aside or setting aside some energy for a rainy day just in case you don't eat, which is not really as much of an issue now as it was for our ancestors when they didn't know when they'd be getting the next meal. For fats, unlike carbohydrates, digestion is going to begin in the small intestine. Your fat is mixed with bile salts from the gallbladder, which is called emulsification, and this is a way to break up the surface area of large amounts of fat so that they have a smaller surface area. They're kind of smaller droplet looking, and then they can go through further breakdown. Okay, so lipase is the enzyme, ASE, that's going to break down lipids. And as we saw in our graphic organizer, that was the step. Your triacylglycerols go through hydrolysis, breaking apart into 3 fatty acids and 1 glycerol molecule. And those will both have different fates. So your glycerol will then head to the liver where it's going to be converted into glucose. And we know that glucose can then be broken down through glycolysis and into your 2-pyruvate, enter your citric acid cycle, electron transport chain, oxidative phosphorylation, lots of energy. Your fatty acids, however, are going to undergo beta oxidation. This is a pathway. So we will take 2 acetyl-CoA and we'll cleave them. That's just a fancy word for break them off of a fatty acid. This does take energy. And for every 2 carbons in your fatty acid chain that you have, you're going to form 1 acetyl-CoA. So these acetyl-CoAs we are going to use to enter the mitochondria and to enter the citric acid cycle. We know that we can get a turn of the citric acid cycle for every acetyl-CoA, and that will produce those electrons And the protons, the hydrogen ions that are picked up by your electron carriers and shuttled off to the electron transport chain. So these electrons are carried by NAD and FADH, I should say NADH and FADH2 to the electron transport chain. And those come from the citric acid cycle. So just to summarize that last slide, what you basically need to know is you have a hydrolysis of a triacylglycerol. Hydrolysis results in fatty acids and glycerol. Glycerol turns into glucose in the liver, and your fatty acids get converted to acetyl-CoA, which can then enter the citric acid cycle and go through everything else you've learned during carbohydrate metabolism. What's really important to note, though, is that you get twice as much energy from fats as you do from glucose. So, for example, a mole of glucose gave us 36 to 38 ATP. That is 0.18 moles of ATP per gram of glucose. In comparison, 1 mole of stearic acid, and that has 18 carbons in its chain, gives us 120 ATP. That's significantly more. And that number does change based on the number of carbons in the fatty acid chain. So the more carbons there are, the more ATP that we get. But roughly, this is 0.42 moles of ATP per gram. So a significant amount more energy we can get from a single gram of fat versus a gram of glucose. All right, so if you're like me, you've been thinking, okay, so a good way to get rid of my fat would be to not eat any carbohydrates, because then it forces the hand, it forces my body to break down that fat as an energy source. And you would be correct. So during starvation, or the Atkins diet, which I feel like has just been rebranded into the keto diet, you are not eating very many carbohydrates. You're specifically avoiding carbohydrates. This condition also can be replicated in patients who have untreated diabetes. So when you are withholding carbohydrates because you're starving, or you're on keto, or you have untreated diabetes, your fatty acids are oxidized, resulting in more acetyl-CoA than your citric acid cycle can handle. In this situation, your body starts to produce ketone bodies. So you have this backup at your citric acid cycle that's producing this excess product, these ketone bodies. When that happens, you run the risk of these ketone bodies accumulating in the blood. So when they accumulate in the blood, you do have a blood buffer system that will handle this, but those ketone bodies will lower the pH of your blood. Hopefully, you're not overloading it so much that your blood buffer system can increase the pH again and your blood's not getting too acidic, but you are kind of starting to play with that. And if you do the Atkins diet or keto too much, you run the risk of going into ketoacidosis, which is where you have a lowering of your blood pH to a dangerous level. But when we produce these ketone bodies, they start to accumulate in the blood, and they can be excreted in the urine. And so when you have untreated diabetes, or you're on the Atkins diet or the keto diet, sometimes people who are doing these diets, their breath smells like acetone, or it smells very sweet. So you can kind of tell that way that somebody is approaching ketoacidosis or is not taking in carbohydrates. The three structures that you see below are the examples of the ketone bodies that are formed if you have too much acetyl-CoA. So it's acetone, acetoacetate, and beta-hydroxybutyrate. You do not need to memorize these. This is just kind of an application of some popular diets and how that is affecting your body, and how that changes how your body, the energy source that your body uses to produce ATP.